Queensland and elsewhere around Oz, and it is to commemorate and to honour those who've been injured and have died as a consequence of the COVID vaccination program. She is a strong voice, an activist, and Forest of the Fallen is one of her projects. She's also very active in a number of other ways, talking truth to power. And we're going to talk about all of that today with Rosie Marshall. It's great to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been an admirer of UK column news for some time. I do have to just tidy up something you said there. I'm actually not the founder of the Forest of the Fallen, and I'm one of many who do forests. However, our particular group on the northern beaches of Sydney has been very active. It was started by a very marvellous woman called Selkie. She lives in Tasmania. And she saw the need. She had always been concerned about vaccinations. And when the COVID vaccines were brought out, she started putting just one or two stakes in the ground with stories of people she'd met. And she realised that we needed to do more of this. So what she did was she contacted Jab Injuries Australia. And a lot of people were submitting their stories to Jab Injuries Australia. So they combined forces. And she started creating a huge file of PDFs of people who've been bereaved or injured. And that is what we access, we people who do forests. And we hold our displays all over the country now. And I understand there are 180 of them. But so it's a wonderful vehicle for very subtly getting the general public to acknowledge and understand the heartache that Australia has gone through as a result of this outrageous behaviour that the government has inflicted on us. It's quite a story what's happened in Australia.
Indeed. And kudos to Silky. Sorry for misrepresenting you, Silky. You are the founder, Silky from Tasmania. And all 180 chapters of Forest of the Fallen around Australia. That is absolutely phenomenal. Just to kind of bring this to life a little bit, could you describe exactly what the forests look like, where they are, how you approach putting them together? It'd be really interesting to hear.
Yes, well, we get the PDF and we have to update, tragically, all the latest people who've been injured or tragically died. So we print them out and I laminate them, and then we put them on a bamboo stick. And I'll just show you, this is one of the stories. Actually, this young girl, her name was Katie Lees, and she was actually featured on mainstream news on Channel 7 here in Australia. And her father is very grateful to us for representing her at Forest. It was a terrible story. She died very soon after an AstraZeneca vaccination. But she's one of many. And what we do is we put the word out on local media, local social media. I have a couple of sites who are people who support me, and they've been incredibly supportive. And I just say, look, we'll be at Coleroy Beach at 11 o'clock on Saturday or Sunday, whenever the weather's the best. And I simply turn up with a huge bag full. I've now got 350 double-sided flags, we call them, and I just put them in the sand and make a forest. And the beauty of doing it on the beaches, look, there are many reasons why I like to do it on the beach. If you plant these forests on council land, you leave yourself open to the council interfering and saying you haven't had permission. And if you ask permission, they won't give it to you. Whereas if you do this display on the beach, it's a little bit like putting up a beach umbrella. They can't say you can't sit there. We have had the occasional ranger who's tried to cause trouble, but I just stand my ground and say the beach is for everyone and you can't stop us. And it's very effective because there's something so iconic about the beauty of our northern Sydney beaches. And it really is very upsetting to see the tragedies that each of these stories is portraying. It's not unusual for people to walk up to it and cry. In fact, I was just talking the other day about, I went to this particularly pretty little beach last Sunday. It's Shelley Beach, which is next to Manly. It's a particularly pretty lovely little beach that you access via a walk along the seafront from Manly. And we set up the forest there. And it was the place where I did the first of the forests that I've done 18 months ago. And we've done one every week since then. We have not missed a week. And that day when I set that forest up, I'd obviously not done it before, and I didn't really know what to expect. But before long, a man who would have been about 45 or so, he came along and he took a look at this and he just burst into tears and basically fell on my shoulder. And he said, I've had a really serious brain injury from my vaccination. But the worst thing is I got my 10 and 12-year-old sons vaccinated. And he was very upset. So that was reminded me of that incident. But I have so many incidents.
We're just going to show a short clip now of the Forest of the Fallen.
Manly Beach in Sydney, the iconic Manly Beach. We're putting up Forest of the Fallen. I've already spoken to 2 people who've taken these injections and had a bad result. People are waking up. So many are out of pocket now from medical expenses, and neither our politicians or the medical profession or anyone else is helping these people. And people who are injured no longer fit into the pro or anti-vax camp. They feel very alone. It's a terrible place to be. And their bravery at speaking out is so honourable and admirable. I hope more people will start speaking out about what's going on, because it needs to stop. Being on the beach, of course, we're mixing with the lifesavers. And the lifesavers were mandated. And we've heard some pretty bad stories about that too. I remember we turned up, our beaches have some strange names. There's a beach, lovely beach called Curl Beach. Heaven knows why, it's probably some sort of Aboriginal name, I'm not sure. But we turned up there one Sunday and it was a beautiful day. But the Surf Lifesaving Clubhouse had a flag at half-mast. And we set the forest up and I thought, well, don't know what this is about. So I wandered down there and spoke to one of the lifesavers, and he said, oh, yes, one of our much-loved lifesavers, he'd been committed to the community for 25 years. He just dropped dead when he was running, and he was 50 and left, I think it was a 12-year-old daughter. And then there are the young ones who come up and tell me that their hearts have been not right since they've had it done. I mean, I've just been listening to the COVID inquiry in the UK, and this emphasis on the very rare, it bewilders me that anyone can describe this as very rare. Every time I set up a forest, I hear more. And every story is a major tragedy. And I think that's the worst of it. But certainly the forest does seem to be the vehicle that strikes to the heart of the matter in quite a gentle way. I mean, obviously we have some detractors who come up. I mean, one of the things that's said to me, which I just find extraordinary, and it happens online, it doesn't actually happen face to face, but online people say that I've made them up. I mean, can you imagine writing now nearly 700 stories, printing out the photographs, laminating them and sticking them on bamboo sticks because I've got nothing better to do? It is the most ridiculous assertion to make. But that seems to be people who are trolls. But actually, at the beach itself, there's very little backlash now. Initially, we did get quite a lot, and it was quite daunting. That's going back 18 months ago, but the landscape's changed hugely. Interestingly, the people who are the most aggressive and angry are people who are in the medical fraternity. And I don't understand why that is.
I think that you're posing a challenge to their entire worldview, and that certainly seems to be the case over here too. So it's astonishing, really, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned the COVID inquiry and their insistence on continuing to use this very rare term when actually it's entirely clear, even just looking at the NHS data that's been gathered, that there's nothing rare about any of these incidents at all. So that's really just protecting the reputation of the establishment and trying to prohibit us from participating in justice, and actually a collective, society-wide moment of reflection, I think, which is required, but which we're being denied, but you're actually providing a space for with Forest of the Fallen. I think it's an incredibly important and powerful thing that you're doing that needs to happen, but that is being prohibited by the people in positions of authority.
It appears very much still that there are people who are true believers in this. And I do notice that doctors often, my own GP, with whom I've irrevocably fallen out now, I hasten to add, he's a true believer. Well, one of them is, there's one who realizes this isn't right, but there's another one who wears a mask the whole time. And I don't think he's opened a recent textbook since 1980. He's just completely embedded in the vaccine being the best thing that's ever happened. But, I've been very fortunate, Ben, because I was broken in very slowly to the realization that there was so much corruption. I mean, my journey started when we moved to Sydney about 12 years ago. And we were both retired, and I had a lot of time on my hands because I didn't know anyone. So I was finding my way around Sydney, and I started going, I went to the Gallipoli Mosque, actually. It's a funny story, this, but look, I'll try and be quick. My grandfather went to Gallipoli, and I heard about the Gallipoli Mosque, so I wanted to go and have a look at it. And it was just before the Lint Cafe happened, as you remember, the attack on Lint Cafe. And what did occur to me was that there was, in that particular pocket of Sydney, was a lot of, quite radical people. And I couldn't understand why no one was saying anything. And I became very interested in the way the media was portraying things. So I did a bit of a dive into all that, and I realized that the media wasn't strictly being honest. And, I've got friends who are Muslims. I'm not being critical of Muslims, but I'm being critical of the way the government was handling things, when it was quite clear that if they'd made some interventions and done a bit more careful looking into things, that we might have avoided some of the things that did happen. And it progressed into a distrust of our politicians and the way they were promoting different things. I was broken in gently into what I started to understand was corruption and lies, basically. So I think what's happened now, the impression I get now, is that people who've been completely trusting in everything and now find that the media, the politicians, the government, and the doctors and scientists have not been completely straight with them. I think it's a tremendous shock, and they can't quite manage to believe that their worldview's been so distorted. I wonder if that's why there's so much cognitive dissonance about this particular issue. Anyway, just to get back on the subject of how I became more aware of the dangers of these injections, my husband's Rob, he wanted us to go on a sea voyage to London. This is back in March 2020. And I'd been to see the doctor I referred to before, and said, we're going to be going via Africa. And he said, you better take some HCQ because of malaria. I sort of remonstrated and said, look, I don't really think I need it. And he said, no, take it. It's very safe. We give it to millions of people. You must have it. So I conceded, and I got the script and put it in the luggage. And we literally had one foot on the gangplank of the ship when the cruise was called off because of COVID. So back to Sydney we went, and it was just the time when there was talk that HCQ was possibly the cure for COVID. So I went back to the doctor and said, looks like this is the go. Can I have another script? And he basically went quite wobbly. He said, I can't give that to you. It's dangerous. And he made an idiot of himself, because it was only 6 weeks prior. He'd said to me it's perfectly safe. And then he said, the pharmacist won't give it to you. Well, by the time we'd had this conversation, I was quite convinced he was lying. And I started doing a lot more of a dive into it. And it just became clear to me that for whatever reason, they were pushing a vaccine on us. And I think it was 2018, I'd taken the first flu jab I'd ever had and promptly got pneumonia and then pericarditis. So when I heard that the vaccine had the potential of causing pericarditis, I was even less impressed. So by the time all that had come around, I was ardently telling people, I think you'd be very wise not to take this. Then I saw Pierre Corey talking about ivermectin, and I did a dive into that. And pretty much just after all that, I started hearing stories. One of my sons, my granddaughter's little classmate, she'd been given one of these vaccines and she died in her sleep. So I was becoming more and more angry, thus the angry grandmother name, that this was happening. And I kept looking into more detail and finding out. I mean, back then it was quite hard. This is back in sort of middle of 2020, towards the end. A little bit was coming out on the internet, and you'd see these terrible visions of people shaking, and you weren't quite sure whether it was true or not. But I just kept looking and looking. And then when this happened to my granddaughter's friend, I just thought, I can't keep quiet. Anyway, I had the very good fortune of joining a group of people who were real movers and shakers, one of whom was Dr. Philip Altman. And Dr. Altman then, in an effort, because he'd had 40 years experience in the pharmaceutical industry, he actually had a pharmaceutical company where he was testing, working for Big Pharma. And when he observed the way the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration here was behaving, he saw so many red flags. And in order to try and get the word out to stop it, he decided he'd run for the seat of Manly, which was a state seat here in New South Wales. And I was desperate to do something. I felt very, very helpless. Anyway, I got on board with Dr. Altman and helped with his campaign. And he taught me so much about what was going on and gave me such a far better understanding than, I'm just a housewife. I'm not a medical person at all. But he gave me a really good understanding of what was happening and inspired me to keep going with this. So I started calling in on a lot more pharmacies and saying to them, because I understood that informed consent couldn't possibly have been given to people. And I realised also that the government was behaving in such a way that was clearly, they were abrogating responsibility. The state premiers, who've all, funnily enough, they've all vaporised. We don't know where they were. They were all complicit in this. But they keep saying they were the ones who really mandated all this, and now they've disappeared. But there's a woman called Elizabeth Hart who does a lot of research into informed consent. She lives in Adelaide, and it's become her real thing to try and expose the fact that people aren't getting informed consent. She's been very helpful. She's forwarded a lot of the emails that she's had from the government, which make it quite clear that there are steps you have to take to get informed consent, and no one has been allowed to have those pointed out to them. So the person who's liable is the man with the needle, or the woman, or the nurse, or whoever. They are the ones who are liable. So I've been saying to pharmacists, do you understand that professional indemnity is not going to cover you? And most of them are completely unaware. In fact, I'd say all of them are completely unaware. They say, oh, I've got insurance. And they think that, well, if a few of their patients drop dead, that doesn't really matter, apparently.
That's a fascinating series of events that you've just described to us there. I mean, the first thing I want to jump in on actually is to your encounter with hydroxychloroquine, HCQ, and the conversation that you had with your GP when you were about to go on a cruise. And the fact that this has been prescribed to millions of people, it's perfectly safe, you must take it with you. And then within weeks, you're having the same conversation. Apparently, it's dangerous. You can't use it. We can't give it to you. The pharmacist won't prescribe it. clearly something has happened there, right? I mean, that's just a smoking gun when it comes to the system intervening in the use of perfectly safe drugs that have been prescribed for decades, right? Like that's astonishing that you saw that firsthand.
Well, you can guess why that was. In March 2020, ARPA, which is it's not even a government agency. It's the most extraordinary thing. I think it's not like your MHRA. That's TGA, but it's the people who decide who can and can't practice, and every medical person has to submit $650 in order to be allowed to continue to be registered. And ARPA sent out a letter to every medical practitioner and chiropractor and psychologist saying, if you give any cause for vaccine hesitancy, you'll be struck off, you'll lose your license. And that's actually what happened to my friend, Dr. Miley Trin, who's just recently had a court case here. The HCCC have taken her to court. She's got a very complicated case. Actually, she discussed it in detail with Dr. Ahmed Malik, but it's a complicated case. And we went through 4 days of the case in November, where she was basically being crucified for saving a woman's life, a woman who was dying of COVID. She lived in the western suburbs of Sydney, and she had very low vitamin D, and she became increasingly unwell, but wouldn't go to the ICU. And Dr. Trin saved her life, but apparently that wasn't enough to placate the powers that be. And it really was the case that Miley Trin, the doctor, saved this woman's life by using ivermectin. That really was what finished her off, and she's been unable to practice now for 3 years. This woman, she's a remarkable person. She should be Australian of the Year rather than the most persecuted doctor in Australia. She was, her mother was killed. She's Cambodian. Her mother was killed in the killing fields in Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge when she was 5. She was sent with one of her sisters to Vietnam, and she worked as in a sweatshop with her aunt, took her in with her little sister. And Miley had to work in this sweatshop, which must have been absolutely shocking. Anyway, they got on a boat when she was 12 and came to Australia. And this little girl who'd been motherless and basically had a really awful childhood arrived here speaking no English, learnt English, worked so hard she became a doctor. And this is how we're treating her. I mean, it's just so appalling. Anyway, she has a lot of support with some of the most marvellous people. And during the last court case, Pierre Corey, Professor Norman Clancy, and Dr. Philip Altman were all expert witnesses on her behalf. And the case hasn't finished yet. I'm just hoping it's going to be concluded, I hope, at the end of March. And I'm just hoping that she will be, the truth will prevail and she'll be all right. But it's been 3 years of hell. They've persecuted her. And the way they treated her in this court case, it was so adversarial. What they were trying to do was to make her admit that she thought more highly of herself than the COVID-19 task force here. And one of the expert witnesses who spoke on behalf of the task force was a Professor Glanville, who had never treated anyone with COVID. He's an expert in transplants. And, obviously, he does do lung transplants, but he'd had no experience with COVID. And the whole court case was awful. But I describe it that the cavalry arrived with Pierre Corey and Professor Clancy, and they just made it very clear that the way that Dr. Trin treated this patient was absolutely the right way. And it was quite glorious to watch the faces of the people, the judge and the people in the court. They, again, I refer to the fact that these people were true believers. There were 2 GPs there as part of the bench, the judicial bench. And it was a rather marvellous moment when one of these GPs said, why didn't you follow the task force's protocol, the ICU protocol? And Mai Lee, in her rather delightful way, just said, well, I trusted my own judgment. And this GP said, you trusted your own judgment? So this was the most outrageous idea that anyone could have possibly posited. And then there was another moment where the other GP, there were two of them there, with the judge sitting behind them and then a member of the public on his left. Anyway, the other GP was speaking to Dr. Philip Altman, who, as I've described, is quite an illustrious person with a very, very wonderful reputation. In fact, he's been heavily involved with the Australian medical professionals here. And he was one of the authors of Too Many Deaths, which is an amazing book, which every politician in Australia has been given a copy of it. So he's not without significant background. Anyway, this woman said to him, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. I suppose you believe in unicorns. I mean, it was the most bizarre episode of absolute outrageous rudeness and ignorance that I've ever witnessed. And to have this in our judiciary was quite shocking. Anyway, the story will continue at the end of March. So hopefully she will prevail. But she's not the only doctor who's been very brave. We've got a Dr. Melissa McCann, who's currently got a class action with 2,000 people who've been injured and seriously injured. And I also went to her court case, which was in early December, and that's with the TGA. Anyway, the TGA barrister informed the court that the TGA had no real duty of care for the people of Australia. Apparently, this is under the umbrella of the fact that we were going through a pandemic. But to say you had no duty of care to the people of Australia was the most extraordinary thing I've ever heard. I mean, that's what we're paying them for. And incidentally, the TGA, I'm sure it's a coincidence, but the TGA between the years, I think it was 2021 and 2023, they somehow got the gift of $45 million from AstraZeneca, Moderna and Pfizer, but I'm sure that was probably a Christmas present for their hard work.
It's ludicrous. What you're describing is ludicrous, Rosie. Like, we use this phrase all the time. It's a little bit cliched, isn't it? But you just couldn't make it up, right? You know, the idea that how dare Mai Lee use her own initiative and actually cure someone as a doctor, you know, but whilst going against the official guidelines handed down by her betters and her superiors, you know, the ones that really know what's going on. I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. And this idea that you've got a regulatory body that actually doesn't own a duty of care to the Australian people, despite the fact that that's what it's for. It's the reason that it exists. It's just incredible, isn't it? Can I just draw you back on a couple of things? And I think we need to talk to Dr. Altman and Dr. Lee as well at some point. I think I'd be fascinated to hear from those two. You mentioned a moment ago that you've been going into pharmacies and you've been talking to them about informed consent and what's been going on, basically delivering a few nuggets of truth to them that they're not getting from their own regulators or from the medical profession. How have you approached that? And because it's quite a sensitive thing, right? You know, and very brave as well, I should say, right? For you to go in and have those conversations. Like, how have you gone about doing it? And you've been documenting it as well, right? I think you've been recording some of those.
Yes, I do. I don't find it particularly brave or daunting. The wonderful thing about getting older, and I'm nearly 70 now, within a week or two, actually, I don't care, frankly. I'll just cover up how that all happened. It would have been 2.5 years ago when, as I said, I was becoming more and more aware of the carnage happening from these injections. And I'd gone into it's a compounding chemist in the main town near where I live. And I was buying something insignificant, and a little 16-year-old girl was doing her Saturday job, and I just got chatting with her, and she started crying. And I said, oh, you know, are you all right? She said, oh, my brother's best friend died last night in his sleep. Anyway, as I walked out, I saw the sign saying, do come in and get your COVID vaccination. And I thought, right, well, I'll be coming back here then. You know, I was just at that point where the little 6-year-old little girl had died, and I had spoken to one pharmacy prior to that. Anyway, I went back in there, and the little girl wasn't in there that day, and I confronted the pharmacist. It's a family-owned pharmacy, and I've found out since that none of them have taken the vaccination, but they're giving my friends their 7th and 8th. I would have been in there 3 or 4 times. And I film it with my phone. One time, one of the pharmacists got very angry and tried to wrestle the phone from my hand. So that was interesting. But I just hold my ground and say, you're doing the wrong thing. And I'm here to say I'm hearing of people who are dying. And in fact, just around the corner from that pharmacy is the printer who prints out all the PDFs of all the people who've been injured and died. And I'd had another 105 of those flags printed, and I was walking back, and that damn sign was outside again. So I went in again with this big pile of papers, and on the top of which was a young man called Connor. And there's a bit more of a story about Connor, as a matter of fact. But he was on the top of this pile, and there's this terrible picture of him lying in a hospital bed with his chest covered with those ports, and frightening. He'd had his second Pfizer injection and had massive heart troubles. Anyway, I showed this pharmacist. I picked up Connor's flag and said, "Look, this is what you're doing. You're advertising the Pfizer vaccine, and this is what the result is." Anyway, his behaviour was quite extraordinary. He almost became quite sympathetic with me and said, "Oh, you're doing a marvellous thing." And I said, "Well, why aren't you stopping doing this?" He didn't seem to have an answer. But, now I've been in there so many times. The minute I walk in there, they all try to shove me out the door. But I just find it so extraordinary that they do that pharmacy must know what they're doing is wrong.
We just have a short clip now of Rosie Marshall challenging a pharmacist about the COVID vaccines, and in particular, the lack of information in the Moderna vaccine.
Oh, thank you very much. Intentionally blank.
Intentionally blank? What does
Because
that mean?
it means that it's actually a...
That's the insert Moderna.
Okay. Yeah, that's what they gave us.
That's why they...
Intentionally blank. And that's this.
Do you feel comfortable here now?
Well, this vaccine has been given.
Unbelievable.
Well, personally, if you thought you were going to be health person,
I have been giving myself doses as well, so I have received all the doses.
You're fine doing that.
Yes.
If you had somebody who came in and said, "What's this?" One of your jobs, how would you feel?
Well, I'm so sorry, but a lot of medicine have side effects, and we don't know who gets reaction to what. So it does save lives.
No, it's very different GMO.
Gee, I'm absolutely shocked. It's intentionally blank.
That's really like
But Connor is the son of a friend of mine, and I've got to know him through this whole hideous time. And I met a journalist for the Daily Mail. I suppose I can say his name, David Southwell. I met him at a meeting, and he rang me a couple of weeks ago, and he said, "I want to do a story on people who've been vaccine injured." And the 2 people who came to mind, the most shocking cases, really, aside from those who've died, like Katie Lee's, that flag I showed you, 34, and she died. And there are plenty of those. But in the case of people who I knew could talk to the media, there were 2. One was this beautiful young girl called Brittany, who I'd met a couple of weeks before. Terrible story with her. She was 19. She was studying physiotherapy, and she had to take the Pfizer vaccine for her course. Anyway, she ended up that night, she took herself to hospital having serious heart problems. And they shooed her out of the hospital saying, "You've got anxiety." She ended up in the gutter outside this hospital ringing her mother to come and get her because she was having what she thought was a heart attack. And indeed, it turned out that her heart's been severely damaged as a result not only of that, but the fact that no one would diagnose what was wrong with her for such a long time, and she became, her condition worsened. But she's very erudite. I knew she'd be able to speak. And of course, Connor, who actually has become a great friend. And when he's feeling well enough, he comes along to the forests to talk to people about what happened to him. He's really good at it. So I submitted those 2 people to this journalist. And he's done stories on both of them. So mainstream news now, and Connor only came out, I think it was last week, and there's been a huge reaction to that. The comments on that have been extraordinary. I would say something like 90 or 95% of the people who commented said, "I know someone who's been damaged." So I do feel like, these young ones They've done a great job. And one of the worst things about this whole disaster is the fact that the vaccine injured are ignored and in some cases mocked. I find it extraordinary that people can say, oh, yes, you were just a sheep and you've taken these vaccines. Not only were so many tricked, and there's just no question in my mind that they were deceived, but in the case of particularly Brittany, who had her life in front of her, she was determined to do this course, and she couldn't continue with it without taking a vaccine. She didn't want to take it, and her mother was very against her taking it. So it wasn't like she was doing it because she wanted to go to the pub. So I find it very painful to see these young people being not only gaslit by the medical fraternity, but not supported by the public. I feel very strongly about that these people should be not only supported, compensated, but admired for running the gauntlet. And there's this strange condition which I have noticed with people who've, even some who've had vaccine injuries, they'll say things like, oh, I'm not going to wear a tinfoil hat now and believe the earth's flat. I did the right thing getting the vaccine. And you see them lying there having had a series of heart attacks and strokes. And you're thinking, why aren't they angry? Why aren't they saying these vaccines are damaging people? Why are they still defending the situation? And I don't quite understand how that happens. But that only adds to the difficulty of the people who bravely do speak up. So I'm a great advocate for anyone, and I don't know whether you've seen them, but when I do these for the forum, quite a lot of people, I'll say, would you like to talk about what happened to you? And I get little interviews with individuals who will share what happened to them. And it's heartbreaking. One of the saddest ones was we were at Coleroy Beach, which is actually where I'm going again this weekend. Coleroy Beach seems to be where we get the saddest interviews. And in fact, the chemist across the road has plastered his entire shop front with invitations to go in and get the Japanese encephalitis and the tetanus and the God knows what else. So I always quite like doing it there across the road from him, hoping he'll see me. But one of the saddest ones was this darling woman, her name was Cecilia, and she was being walked along the seafront in a wheelchair. She's a very attractive woman, but she'd lost the ability to swallow or speak or walk. And her carer said that she had had 5 of these injections and she'd had a severe neurological impact. I understand her parents were elderly, and I think they were Chinese. Or one of them might have been Chinese. And I understand she just finished a degree in forensic law, and I believe she'd been a dancer. She was a very attractive woman who'd obviously been a vibrant person. And I went up to her and knelt next to her in her wheelchair and held her hand, and this single tear ran down her cheek. And I said, would you like me to tell your story? And she nodded. So I did this little video showing her, holding her hand and sharing what had happened to her. And that went viral. And all of us were just in floods of tears. It was harrowing. It was a terrible, terrible day. And that darling woman apparently died, I think it was October. So these are the people we're representing, and these are the people for whom I want to keep speaking out for.
We're here at Coleroy Beach with Cecilia. Cecilia had 5 vaccinations and she got COVID, and unfortunately she became neurologically damaged. She's a 52-year-old and she's developed headaches after having 5 injections and then getting COVID, and then it progressed to her inability to speak, inability to swallow, and inability to walk. Cecilia has consented to me doing this because she doesn't want this to happen to anyone else. She's one of the bravest people I've met in this terrible journey, and I'd like to say thank you for sharing the story, and we are going to do everything we can to stop this happening to anyone else. Thank you very much, Cecilia.
And that we're trying to secure justice for ultimately, right? That's the process that we need to go through. It's beginning, we think, maybe. I mean, there's some official stuff happening in the UK. I don't hold out much hope for those proceedings, but, as as a community, as a society, outside of the institutional processes, I think that we need to keep this conversation going. It's crucial we keep this conversation going, that it continues to grow and we can continue to fight for the people that you've described, the people that have been injured, the people that have died because of this thing that happened to us all 5 years ago now. It's astonishing, really, to think, that we're 5 years into this, and actually the impacts they're still there, and actually in many ways they're continuing to grow. This is it's a human tragedy, the scale of which I don't think we've ever seen before.
What I'm finding now is I met someone, a guy of about 45, I suppose, or perhaps 50. This was a couple of weeks ago, and he said his father-in-law had just died in his sleep, and it had been a harrowing experience for the whole family. But he had to do a medical for his work, and he went off and had all the checks. And they said, do you realise your heart's in real trouble? And he hadn't realised. He'd been quite athletic. In fact, I think he said he'd been a marathon runner, or certainly very athletic. And he said he'd had no indication, and he thought he'd got away with it. But suddenly it started becoming evident that something was wrong. But the number of people, particularly young men, who come up to me and say they felt like they've had someone sitting on their chest ever since they had the vaccination. And, it's hard to know what to say. I mean, I do always suggest they get onto the FLCCC protocol in the hope that might help them. But because I'm not medical and it's not part of my purview at the Forest of the Fallen to offer any medical advice, it just seems so cruel that so many people have taken it to just keep a roof over their heads and feed their families. There would never be an occasion where I've done a forest without hearing something from someone that's happened to them. And interestingly, how many of them are prepared to speak up on camera. I think a lot of people have found it quite cathartic to say this is what happened. Well, I hope they do. And I don't know whether they realise what a help it is for us that they do have the courage to do that, because so often I get feedback. I mean, I'm not very good on social media, but Cecilia's video had millions. Well, I certainly think it would have had 1 million views. It came up everywhere. It was very widespread. I don't know whether she ever knew that. Some of the ones that you don't think really are particularly full of impact seem to really get shared a lot. So I hope we're getting somewhere. We did have the mainstream news on Channel 7 with Spotlight, where there were some remarkable people who spoke up about stopping these vaccines. Gigi Foster, Professor Gigi Foster, was in the audience, and she spoke very well. And Katie Lee's father was there speaking on her behalf. But it always strikes me when you hear people from the medical profession just in the most dogged fashion holding on to the holy grail of vaccine, that no one can question it. Actually, Dr. William Bay, who's just recently had a success, you might have heard of this. He took APRA to court and he won. This was just before Christmas. He won on a point of law that his opposition had. I don't understand the points at all finally, but anyway, he did win this case, which was quite significant. And in the course of discussions after that, he said he'd always doubted vaccines because when he was studying medicine, on the day that was going to be the discussion about vaccines, he said he turned up ready to hear all about it because he was really interested to hear the backstory. And the professor stood up there and he said, we're running out of time, so we're not going to talk about vaccines because you all know it's the best thing that ever happened to mankind. And that was the end of it. It's just coming to light now through RFK Jr. and Aaron Siri, his barrister, that Aaron Siri has been in court and used Stanley Plotkin, the godfather of vaccines, as an expert witness. And in the most brilliant manner, Aaron Siri got Stanley Plotkin to admit that there'd been no proper trials for any vaccines, none of the childhood ones, none of them. So Stanley Plotkin, at the age of 93, has had to come clean about the fact that placebos have not been in place. And basically all these injections have got no proper backup or credible trials behind them. Actually, it was a very interesting podcast with Brett Weinstein and Dr. Toby Rogers just in the last week. I've always been a bit of a fan of Brett Weinstein, and in this interview, Toby Rogers was discussing the passing of aluminium through the blood-brain barrier, and he had looked into the autism problem. Anyway, he uncovered the fact that the trials regarding the access of aluminium through to the brain, the trials were on 4 white rabbits, and only 3 were remaining in the trial. They don't know what happened to the other rabbit. And it was evident that the aluminium went through to the brain and all sorts of organs of these rabbits. So, that is the reason that we have aluminium as an adjuvant to vaccines. I haven't explained that very well, but it's worth having a look at that video because it's actually profoundly shocking to hear more and more about how there's been no proper trialling of any of these vaccinations. And in fact, the Hep B vaccination, which is given to newborn children, literally on the first day of life, apparently on the insert of that, they have to describe the trial data, which was for 147 children. And the duration of the trial was 5 days. And this is the vaccination we give to newborn children weighing 8 pounds. And this vaccination was originally devised for sex workers and drug addicts. So yet to meet a newborn with a needle at the ready, other than being administered to it.
It's hideous, isn't it? The pharmaceutical industry has so much to answer for. You mentioned RFK Jr. there. I'm very interested. I had actually heard about that testimony from Stanley Plotkin. I need to go and watch it, but I was rather disappointed to see that the day one recommendation from the new Trump administration was that we're all going to be taking cancer vaccines now, developed by big tech billionaires. The whole kind of Maha movement seems like it might be dead on arrival, but we shall see.
Absolutely appalled. I can't see any justification. Actually, interestingly, in Australia, we've got the biggest mRNA factories being finished off. I think they've just finished the one in Melbourne, paid for by the taxpayer, of course. And there's another one at Macquarie, and I believe there's one up in Queensland. We've invested billions in this shonky platform, which is designed to kill us all. And Scott Morrison, when he was congratulating himself on this marvellous feat of opening this or organising this shocking treasonous activity, said that Australians weren't going to have any choice in the matter. We're going to have the vaccine that's produced in Australia, he announced. Actually, that's another little facet I do like to cover. Scott Morrison in 2014 was the minister in charge of health. And clearly he was an ambitious man with his eye on the prime ministership. Apparently, and again, this is hearsay, but I have no reason to disbelieve it because there are too many coincidences. At the time, Rupert Murdoch, his son, was working for GlaxoSmithKline, and his mother, Dame Elizabeth Murdoch, whom everyone held in the highest esteem, she was one of the architects of the Murdoch Institute for Children's Medical Research, basically just a vaccine hub, a place where they're just making up vaccines. Anyway, it apparently Murdoch and Scott Morrison got together and decided that in order to get any consideration for early childcare, to get consideration for the government for the costs of that, you had to make sure your children were mandated to take the vaccine. Probably just a coincidence of some sort that Scott Morrison obliged and put that in, and now all the children going to early childcare have to be vaccinated. I just find that coercion is so far wide of what's acceptable that you have to have your child vaccinated in order to get any compensation for the childcare. Actually, it was Russell Broadbent, one of our MPs here. He's very good on that. He's really trying to bring that to the fore, that we've got to stop mandating vaccination for childcare. It's all wrong.
It is all wrong. It is all wrong, and it's just total coercion. by the state. And it's absolutely everywhere, unfortunately, and it appears to be getting worse. But I do hope that they're reaching the point where this is becoming unacceptable to the majority. I think people are going to start pushing back against these ridiculous overreaches by government power. I mean, it's just astonishing what these people think they can do. And actually, you've ventured into an interesting area, right? So we've talked a lot about clinicians, pharmacies, and the kind of medical dynamic to this. But you started talking a bit about politics, and I've noticed that you'd spoken recently at a local council meeting, I think it was. Could you tell me a bit about that and how, you know, what you're seeking to do there and what you and how that process is unfolding?
I think it was early December. Port Hedland, which is a local council community over in Western Australia, it's a mining community that's got a large proportion of Aboriginals there in that community. And apparently Aborigines do not tolerate these vaccinations well. Poor Aboriginal children, the average Australian child gets 43 injections prior to the age of 4, but unlucky Aboriginal children get 47. And ADHD and autism is rife amongst the Aboriginal community of children, apparently, so I'm told. Anyway, it was observed by a man called Adrian McRae, who was a counsellor at Port Hedland, that they were getting 7 times as many deaths in their community as they had prior to the rollout. So he put it to the council, and the vote was taken, and I think it was 5-2 or something, that they should stop the vaccine. But he also got Professor Angus Dalgleish to speak on Zoom and back up his assertions. So that went viral. And on the strength of that, I decided I'd go and speak to the Northern Beaches Council. Unfortunately, I did submit, I was only allowed a 3-minute discussion, and then they shut me down. But I was lucky I had a lot of support that night, and a lot of people came along holding the Forest of the Fallen flags. So it made quite an impression. And subsequently, I wrote to each councillor individually and gave them the full account of my speech and said I'm expecting them to be contacting the local people providing these injections and warning them of their liability. Anyway, I haven't heard back from a single one of them, so I'm not surprised.
And we actually have a short clip of Rosie speaking at the Northern Beaches Council meeting.
I'm here representing those who've been injured by the COVID injections and those who've been bereaved. The flags around the chamber demonstrate that this is what the Forest of the Fallen bears witness to. Although we were all told these injections were safe and effective, conservative estimates are that 17 million deaths have occurred worldwide and 1 in 800 is severely injured. These injections have not stopped transmission or provided immunity. Hospitalisation was not minimised, and 94% of those who died from COVID had underlying disease processes. This represents a massive medical experiment.
What's next then for Forest of the Fallen and for your activities over in Australia? I've got to say, Rosie, you're doing a phenomenal job, right? I mean, I'm sure that you hear this all the time, but you are out there fighting for people in a way that it's very rare to see. And, you know, they're lucky to have you, frankly. And, you know, the impact that you've had and that you are going to have in the future is difficult to overstate, I think. So well done. More power to you. And what's next? Next
Saturday at Collaroy Beach. I don't have aspirations for anything more. In fact, I'm constantly amazed that this has landed in my lap and I just can't look away is basically what's happened. None of this was by design, and I've certainly got no ambitions to be a podcaster or do anything. In fact, I make a point of never appearing in any of the Forest of the Fallen videos because it's not about me. So I take it week by week. Every week I'm at a different beach. I've got fantastic people who help me, and we just go along and poke all the flags in the sand and see who comes to talk with us and try and comfort people who've been injured. Other than that, I don't know what else I can do. However, one thing that has been very heartening is that, and I think it's actually important, a lot more people are confronting the chemists. And I think it's not working confronting the politicians. They're too protected. But I think now there's someone who is giving a package out to people who want to confront chemists. And in the package is all the Pfizer adverse events, a cease and desist letter, a whole lot of information about how best to do it. And I think if more people start doing that at the coalface, I can't really see, and the forest, the fawn, they seem to be the two things that make an impact. I do believe that we have to crack this cognitive dissonance. So often when I go along to these chemists and say to them, do you realise, actually the latest figures, I'll just tell you what the latest figures are. This is from Open Dane, which is the Australian version of the VAERS. 141,112 cases of adverse events, 1,042 deaths, 9 of which are children, aged 5 to 17. However, the TGA reports only 14 deaths from jabs on the DAEN, but it is 1,042. And 35 of those died on the day they got the jab, and 184 of those died within 3 days. Actually, 52% of those deaths occurred within the 20 days subsequent to vaccination. And I'm sure you're aware of the fact that you're not classified as vaccinated until 2 weeks post the jab. They say that the vaccination hasn't taken, so you're classified as unvaccinated. So that's a very convenient way of covering up half of the deaths that occur almost straight after. And just on that subject, I believe it's 79% of babies who succumb to SIDS have had a wellness check or a vaccination within something like a week prior. I understand it's something, that kind of ratio. So these vaccinations have an awful lot of questions to be answered, and I'm hoping that RFK, it is very disappointing about this business of the mRNA cancer vaccines that big tech think they're going to be able to do. I mean, aside from the fact that no doubt people will be treated for cancer when it's something they would have recovered from, perhaps. I don't know, as I keep saying, I'm not medical. But I do think that a lot of these things are overdiagnosed, and it just seems to be a big money racket for the big pharma. But I'm hoping RFK, he in the past, and Aaron Siri holds him in the highest regard, as do other people like Ed Dowd, who I have respect for. People who are really trying to stop this still hold him in high regard. I just hope that he's able to prevail and that he can knock some sense into Trump's head and stop any more of this nonsense. But there's just so much money tied up with the mRNA platform now, so we're going to have a very, very difficult time. However, I think this coming year, unfortunately, is going to be when we see a massive number of terrible implications as a result of these injections. It seems to be happening. People are talking to me more, saying that they thought they were okay, but now they're relapsing. And anecdotally, one of the worst things is to have had 3 or 4 of these injections, then to get COVID and then get another injection. Every time people who have had that number of vaccines gets COVID, they become more unwell. And I just think the immune system becomes more compromised. So I think when we see more of that happening is when we're going to have a really, really awful time, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's inevitable at this point. It's been baked in since the start, basically. Those numbers that you've just read out, the latest numbers from Australia, they sound about the same proportionally to what we've had here in the UK. So you said, I think, 1,042 deaths on a 20 million population. We're about 65 million population. We've had officially 2,500 deaths, although they stopped taking the numbers properly into the yellow card reporting scheme. Gosh, probably a couple of years ago now. They were doing weekly updates and they stopped doing those. And then they started playing around with the statistics, so it was impossible to actually tell what was going on. And I'm sure that it's very similar that the numbers are actually massively underreported. So it's estimated that those figures are actually anything from 10 to 100 times underreported, right? So you could be looking at 100,000 people dead in Australia, 250,000 people dead in the UK because of this, and yet they're still putting them into people's arms. It's absolutely astonishing. But as you say, a lot of this is driven by money. It's the pharmaceutical industrial complex. And in the case of the Larry Ellison announcement, the Project Stargate announcement made by the Trump administration on Tuesday, it's $500 billion of investment in RNA and artificial intelligence. Apparently, these things are intrinsically linked to each other, but, who knows why.
Well, interesting that you bring that up, because my understanding is it's underreported by at least 1 to 6%, and putting that in the middle at 3%, it means that we've had 34 or 35,000 deaths. But just something else I felt suddenly came to mind that I should mention. Every now and then I do a ring around of pharmacies, and I say, look, I pretend I'm pregnant, and I say, I'm sort of 3 months pregnant, I'm going abroad, do you think I should get the vaccination? And out of 8 pharmacies that I rang a couple of months ago, 6 of them without hesitation said, yes, get the booster. And 2 of them one said no, and one said, check with your obstetrician. But I recently heard an interview with a woman, in fact, who I've met, so I can validate that she's a genuine woman. She's a funeral director. And she was saying, just trying to find it, that she had 1 baby death a month, and now she's getting 4 a week, stillbirths. And apparently the placentas, they're finding these placentas are calcified, which obviously means that they're not nourishing the babies, and that's why the babies are dying. And the current protocol for pregnant women, I'm sure Debbie Evans will be delighted to hear that the latest COVID injection, which came out last month apparently, is what they like to give pregnant women, with RSV, pertussis and flu, in case you haven't had enough when you're pregnant.
Unbelievable. So look, the confronting chemist thing, I think, is really interesting. You've mentioned that. I just want to bring that back up before we kind of bring the discussion to a close, because I personally think that the official review process is not going to deliver anything. Ultimately, they're not designed to deliver anything. They're designed to protect the status quo, protect the establishment, to give a platform for people like Matt Hancock to come on and basically rewrite history, frankly, deny that they did the things they did and blame it on other people and avoid accountability, frankly. But going into chemists and talking directly to pharmacists and presenting them with packages of information and doing that in a very non-confrontational way, I think that's the crucial point here, right? And actually, I think mothers and grandmothers in particular, I think, are best placed to do this, because it's very difficult for the chemists to present it as an attempt to threaten or intimidate, essentially, right? Where if it was a young man or even an slightly older man doing it, it's much easier for them to kind of misrepresent that as something that it isn't ultimately, right? So tonally, it's something that you've absolutely got to get right. So I love that you're doing it. I love that there are more people doing that, and actually it'd be great to get hold of the package of information that you described, and potentially we could look at sharing that. And I think it's something that should be happening more around the UK as well, because I think that's a really impactful thing that you're doing, and that could really help to cut through. And actually, the more of any of these things that we can do, the better ultimately, because even though we're 5 years into this, as you very rightly described, it's still going on. It's still going on. They're still injecting pregnant women. How on earth is this happening?
It's so hard to believe. And the current protocol, if you're in hospital, still is remdesivir, which we all know is deadly. So I actually reflected on a conversation I had with Jackie Devoy, who you know, and she said to me, this was last March, nearly a year ago, she said to me, surely there's no one who doesn't know now what this is about. And I said to her at the time, you'd be amazed. There are lots of people who still don't know. And I have to say, sadly, even now, I still find people who had no idea and who don't believe me. And mostly they're people who are pharmacists who just refer to the TGA and say what you're saying is not true.
again, it's the institution protecting itself, and professionals who are institutionalized, and they're not capable of independent thought. And actually, just to go back to the comment that Miley received in her court case, where essentially the guy questioning her was just absolutely disbelieving that she could possibly do something that wasn't the official doctrine handed down from the regulator. I mean, what on earth did you think that you were doing, woman? You know, it's crazy, but that's how these people are trained up. It's how the whole system, it's how it works ultimately. So anyway, Rosie, thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. I'm going to propose to you a new nickname. I don't think you're the angry grandmother. I think you are the implacable, relentless, and resolute grandmother, right? Because I don't sense anger from you, but I sense a real steely determination to make sure that justice is served. And I'll leave that with you. You don't have to respond to that. But it's been fantastic to talk to you today. Rosie Marshall from Sydney, representing Forest of the Fallen and representing the victims of the COVID vaccination programme. Thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic speaking to you on UK Column this afternoon.
Thank you very much for having me, Ben. And I hope that the Forest of the Fallen, the idea spreads to the UK as well. Be thrilled to see it happening there. Mind you, your beach is a bit rocky, so I don't know how you manage with the sand. Thank you anyway.
We have some nice beaches. You should go to Cleethorpes. It's great up there. Anyway, for now, thanks everybody, and take care. Speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.
I traveled across the nation to sing for our freedom. I arrived in Coffs Harbour. No time for vacation. When I walked into the festival, I saw a sight I'd never seen before. A sea of signs waving in the breeze. What was written there, I had to see. This was the forest of the fallen. Do you know what this means? In the forest of the fallen, you will see and you will grieve. Every picture told a story of death and injury. From our so-called vaccinations, mandated throughout our nation, there were people moving slowly in the forest of the fallen. I was singing right beside it, could not stop my tears from rolling. This was the forest of the fallen. Do you know what this means? In the forest of the fallen, you will see and you will grieve. The silence, it was deafening. The signs were so shocking. Do you know how many neighbors will never work again, never live again? This was the forest of the fallen. Do you know what this means? In the forest of the fallen you will see, and you will grieve lest we forget, 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 lest we forget the fallen.